Welcome into another Carlos Correa emergency edition of Fantasy Baseball today on Tuesday, January 10th. Frank Stampfl joined by Chris Towers. Fun fact, the last time we did one of these emergency pods, Carlos Correa signed with the Mets. Yet here we are once again. So I'm not sure that there's going to be a fourth team. Hopefully not. Let's jump right in. And Carlos Correa is officially headed back to the Minnesota Twins after all. Let's just kind of walk through the timeline here. This started with a 13-year, $350 million deal to the San Francisco Giants. That got scrapped. Then a 12-year, $315 million deal with the New York Mets. Now that gets scrapped. And here we are, 6 years, $200 million to the Twins, which includes a vesting option for 4 years and $70 million, which could be added on to the 6 years. So this could turn into a 10-year, $270 million deal, but that's something for 6 years from now. That's when we'll focus on that. The Giants and Mets both had issues with Carlos Correa's physical, which apparently there's something wrong with Carlos Correa's lower right leg, which he broke back in 2014 in the minors. But I don't think that's going to be an issue for the Twins, considering they signed him last offseason. And clearly they're looking to sign him once again here. Chris, your initial reaction, no Giants, no Mets. Now Carlos Correa headed back to the Minnesota Twins.
Yeah, I think the initial reaction is you'd rather have Carlos Correa going to the Mets if you were going to draft Carlos Correa. But all in all, it's not, given the uncertainty around his health and the fact that the Mets pulled back and there were all these reports, it's not terribly surprising that he ended up not going to the Mets. It was kind of surprising that he ended up being there to begin with. It sounds like Steve Cohen kind of pushed his front office around to get this done. And, ultimately we end up with the status quo, which is Carlos Correa going back to the place he was last year, which we know how he performs in this park. We know what to expect for the most part. And, I think it's probably a downgrade for his value not going to the Mets. It's a much better lineup in New York, but it doesn't change his outlook too much. I do wonder, does the ongoing nature of this ankle issue, does it mess with his value, at least in the way people perceive him from the start of the offseason? That's going to be something interesting to see.
That is an interesting question. I think the price on Correa has been fair all along. The ADP over the last month, 122.8 as a 15 shortstop off the board. It seems like a good deal all around. I know he doesn't run, which obviously NFBC formats, you want as many steals, as many overall complete 5x5 players as you can possibly get. So I understand that aspect of it. But either way, Correa could be a legit 4-category contributor. So he seems like a good deal right now. I wonder if that price will come back down a little bit now that he's not going to the New York Mets. Last year, Correa finished 104th overall in Roto, which again, he did that with terrible counting stats. 71 scored, 64 RBI. He was inside the top 105. Now this year, his ADP has moved back 20 spots. It just doesn't really make sense. Maybe people were waiting to see where Carlos Correa would sign. Ultimately, I think the counting stats should be better. Obviously, we need Byron Buxton and Jorge Polanco and all these guys to stay healthy because that will help with the counting stats for Carlos Correa. But he hits the ball really hard for a shortstop. I think we're going to get 22 to 25 home runs, something like that, and a really good batting average once again. Chris, I think an underrated aspect of this, and you kind of talked about how the value won't be as good now that he's not going to the Mets. He's not going to play third base either. That was something last time we spoke that we were kind of propping up his value because third base is kind of a wasteland. And now Carlos Correa will not be playing third base, at least not this year. He will be playing shortstop. So I think that's something we need to factor in as well.
Yeah, that hurts his value, and I could see his ADP dropping as a result of this. And I actually think that's a good thing because, like you said, finishing 105th last season, obviously, part of that is just he was mostly healthy, and guys who play 136 games are going to rank relatively highly. But, like you said, the counting stats were just outrageously bad. He had 1 home run with runners in scoring position. He only had 30 RBI and 121 plate appearances with runners in scoring position. The prior year, he had, I think it was something like 66 RBI and 180 plate appearances with runners in scoring position. So that kind of tells you how far off. And you can point to, well, it's a worse lineup and than he had in Houston, certainly a worse lineup than he would have had in New York. But I even with that, I think you easily take the over on, what was it, 70 runs and 64 RBI. Like I think if nothing else changes, he's the exact same player as he was last year. He probably gets to 85, 85. You know, I don't think that's asking too much. And obviously I don't think that's the ceiling. I think that's closer to what you should expect the floor to be.
And which cat are we hearing in the background, Chris? Is that Liz Lemon?
That is Liz Lemon. She's a diehard Mets fan, and she's distraught at this news. Actually, she wants to be let out of my office, but I gave her the choice to come in or out, and she chose in. So you got to live with your decisions, Lemon.
Ah, those pesky cats. I know it all too well. We'll talk about this from a Mets perspective in just a little bit. I want to talk about that ADP a little bit more. Over the last month, over at the NFBC, 122.8 is the ADP for Carlos Correa, the 15th shortstop off the board. Chris, I know we're kind of working on our rankings, which will be out next week on the site, so make sure you look around for those. But Correa is going 11 picks behind his Houston Astros replacement in Jeremy Pena. Who would you rather have, Correa or Pena? You are muted, sir.
I could see the case for Pena, you know, as a player who's making, you know, who's on the upswing and all that. But, like, unless you really need stolen bases, I think Carlos Correa is just a dramatically better player. I know Pena had a very good postseason, and maybe he'll carry that over into, you know, a big year too. But I just think the underlying skill sets, the track record, everything we've seen from Carlos Correa suggests that he's just a much better hitter than Jeremy Pena. And I don't know, maybe the 10 to 15 steals that Pena gives you can make up for the gap, but I don't think so.
Pena is a fun player, man. So I get why this is so close. I currently have Carlos Correa ranked one spot higher. They're back-to-back. But, man, Pena really, really flashed in the postseason. And I think it's something he could carry over into this year. Obviously, a much better lineup, too, with the Houston Astros. The other name here, going back-to-back with Correa, is Amed Rosario. Correa just not even 2 picks ahead of Amed Rosario. What do you think about those two?
Another one where I think you can make a case for Rosario. The stolen bases, again, are kind of doing a lot of the heavy lifting. But, man, it was an empty batting average last season. I mean, he hit 283. His OPS was actually slightly down from the year before, but we've gotten a lot more excited about him. I'm not exactly sure I understand why Rosario is viewed more excuse me, my cat jumped on the desk. Why Rosario is viewed so much more positively right now. I think he's fine, but it's really like stolen bases and batting average are important. They're hard to find, but I'll take the all-around skill set from Carlos Correa, who should be a better source of batting average than Rosario as well.
For what it's worth, Amed Rosario finished 67th overall in Roto last year, so quite a bit higher than Correa, probably because he played more games, so that factors into the batting average. He scored,
the 86 runs helped too.
Yep, the runs scored, and obviously the 18 steals. And maybe Rosario runs a little bit more this year with the new rules. He's always been really fast. It's just kind of weird that he's never, had a big steals output, something like 25 to 30 for Amed Rosario. Let's talk about this quickly from a Minnesota Twins perspective. And I kind of want to focus on their prospects more than anything else. I think, this is a slight boost to those around Correa, Byron Buxton, Polanco. They'll see a few more counting stats, obviously. But the big prospects for the Twins coming up sooner rather than later are middle infielders. Royce Lewis is rehabbing from a second torn ACL, expected to be back sometime in the middle of the season. We've seen him play outfield a little bit here or there, so I guess that's the path for him. But there's also a second baseman in Edward Julian who lit up the Arizona Fall League. He was either the MVP or most improved player, most outstanding player, something like that. He was awesome. He's going to play second base. So we've got middle infield prospects, and now the Twins just signed Carlos Correa. So what do you think about that, Chris?
I think you worry about that when it happens, and the fact that Carlos Correa, we feel pretty confident that he could be a third baseman in the long run. He might be a better fit at third base defensively. I think that's not something I'm too concerned about. You have, Luis Arias, who can move around and play a bunch of different positions, so I don't think, it's going to block Jose Miranda if it comes to it. It's the kind of problem that if it becomes a problem for the Twins, it's a good problem for them to have.
All right. Liz Lemon agrees. She thinks it's a good problem for the Minnesota Twins. Let's wrap up with those New York Mets, Liz Lemon's favorite team, as you mentioned. What happens now? Well, Eduardo Escobar welcome back. You have a job once again. You are the starting third baseman for the Mets for now, assuming they don't go out and make another move. This also creates a clearer path for one of their top prospects, Brett Beatty, to work his way into a third base opportunity if Escobar doesn't, if he's not performing well or whatever the reason. I think this makes it easier for Brett Beatty to get back to the majors. And Roster Resource has moved Starling Marte back into the 2-hole in the Mets lineup. So if anybody had concerns over that, I think it's good things for Starling Marte, good things for Eduardo Escobar as well.
Yeah, absolutely good things for Starling Marte moving back up in the lineup. Beatty, the Mets have been more conservative with their top prospects than I think certainly a lot of Mets fans and a lot of the fantasy community would prefer, specifically with Francisco Alvarez and Brett Beatty over the past, like the last few months of last season. I think a lot of people would have rather seen those guys up. And so, I think it clears paths for both of them, right? Because it gives them one fewer really, really good player who's locked into a spot, whether it's, third base and they, can't play Beatty there, or whether it just gives them another option at DH. I think it makes it more likely that we see more of Beatty and Francisco Alvarez.
All right. Well, once again, Carlos Correa is headed back to the Minnesota Twins on a 6-year, $200 million deal, which includes a vesting option for 4 more years and $70 million on top of that. Overall, looks like value is back down a little bit compared to last time we spoke because he will not be playing for the New York Mets and Carlos Correa will not be playing third base. So keep those things in mind. We're going to wrap there. For Chris, I am Frank. Thank you all for listening and watching this emergency edition of Fantasy Baseball Today. We'll be back later on today. Bye-bye.